Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. My name's Grant. I'm a longtime listener and I'm a forestry technician at the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska. I've been out here for 6 years now, and let me tell you, it's made for one heck of a place to work. It's beautiful, brutal, generous, and unforgiving all at the same time. But it's also the only place I've ever experienced genuine, debilitating terror that still wakes me in the dead of night, heart hammering against my ribs like it's trying to escape my chest. I didn't set out to be a forestry tech. Not originally. But having grown up in northern Minnesota, I spent most of my spare time outdoors, either fishing or hiking with my dad. He was a logger, and we had the woods right there on our doorstep. Those early morning walks before school, when frost still clung to every pine needle and our breath came out in white clouds, taught me more than any classroom ever could. From a very early age, I learned stuff like how to spot a healthy tree from a sick one, how to listen to the wind and read what it was telling you, or how to know when a storm was coming by the way the birds went quiet and the air pressure changed. I could feel it in my bones before the first drops fell. I liked the quiet of it. How walking in the woods always felt like an adventure, even if we were just checking the same trails we'd walked 100 times before. Every season brought something different. Spring morels pushing through dead leaves. Summer's thick canopy that turned the forest floor green and dim. Autumn's explosion of color that made you stop and stare even when you had work to do. Winter's stark silence when the world seemed to hold its breath under snow. And I always thought it'd be the coolest thing in the world to have a job where that's all you ever did. Where getting paid meant being outside instead of trapped in some fluorescent-lit office counting down minutes until you could escape. After high school, I bounced around poorly paying jobs, gas stations, warehouse work, a miserable 6 months at a call center that nearly broke me. But all they did was make me realize that I wanted something which kept me outside, away from cities and noise and the grinding monotony of modern life. I went to community college, got an associate's degree in natural resources, and then landed a seasonal gig with the U.S. Forest Service in Minnesota. The pay wasn't great, but it didn't matter. I was finally doing what I was meant to do. Alaska wasn't part of the plan until a buddy from that first job, a guy named Tommy who'd grown up in Sitka, told me about openings in the Tongass. He said it was a great deal. Remote, rugged, nothing like the tame forests back home. It's real wilderness up there, he told me over beers one night. The kind of place where you can walk for days and never see another soul. The kind of place that reminds you how small you really are. So I applied. And when I got the offer 3 weeks later, I packed my truck with everything I owned and drove up through Canada. It took me 5 days to reach Ketchikan. Driving through British Columbia's mountains and the long stretches of the Alaska highway where gas stations were hours apart and you learned to fill up whether you needed it or not. I'd pull over at rest stops and just stare at the landscape, trying to wrap my head around the scale of it all. When I finally caught a float plane to my first posting, flying over endless green that stretched to every horizon, I was hooked. The scale of the Tongass blew me away. It's 17 million acres of mountains and temperate rainforest, bigger than some U.S. states even, bigger than West Virginia, I learned later. You could fit entire cities in there, and they'd disappear without a trace. I signed on full-time after that first season. And even after the experience I'm about to tell you, I still don't regret coming here. Not entirely, anyway. Out here, it's just you and the trees. Ancient spruce, hemlocks, western red cedar, all stretching up 100 feet or more. Their trunks so thick that 3 men linking hands couldn't encircle them. The understory's dense with ferns and devil's club, vicious plants with spines that'll go right through work gloves and fester if you're not careful. The ground's a sponge of moss and rotting logs. Everything slowly decomposing and feeding the next generation. It's a cycle that's been going on for thousands of years, long before humans showed up, and it'll keep going long after we're gone. It's my job to monitor timber stands, check for disease outbreaks that could devastate whole sections, mark trees for harvest when the permits come through, and sometimes just walk the trails to make sure everything's holding together after storms, or to check for illegal logging activity. I've got a little cabin near the ranger station, about 2 miles down a gravel road that turns to mud whenever it rains, which is most of the time. Nothing fancy, 1 room with a wood stove, A narrow bed, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with field guides and a few paperbacks I've read so many times the spines are broken, but it's mine. There's something satisfying about that ownership, about having a space that belongs to you even if it's just a weathered box in the middle of nowhere. After a day in the field, when my boots are crusted with mud and my rain gear's soaked through despite its promises, I'll sit on the porch with a beer and watch the mist roll in off the water. Sometimes it comes slow, creeping through the trees like something alive. Other times it drops like a curtain, cutting visibility to 20 feet in seconds. It's a good life with a kind of peace that you can't find anywhere else. The kind that settles into your bones and makes the rest of the world seem distant and unimportant. What I hate, though, is the weather. It rains around 200 days a year in the Tongass. And not just a light drizzle either. The drops come down in sheets, cold and relentless, driven sideways by winds that howl through the valleys. You're almost constantly soaked through during the wetter months. No matter how waterproof your gear claims to be, water finds ways in down your collar, up your sleeves, through seams you didn't know existed. Your socks stay damp for days. Your skin gets pruny and starts to crack. Everything in your pack, no matter how carefully sealed, takes on a faint smell of mildew. Winters are worse. The days shrink to nothing, just a few hours of gray light that never quite feels like daylight. By mid-December, it's dark by 4 in the afternoon, and the darkness feels absolute, pressing in from all sides. The wind cuts through every layer you wear, finding exposed skin and turning it red and raw. Temperatures drop below freezing and stay there for weeks. The rain turns to sleet, then snow, transforming the forest into something alien and hostile. I've had days where I couldn't leave the cabin at all, where the storm was so violent that opening the door would have meant losing it to the wind. But then there's also the isolation. I don't mind being alone. You can't do this job if you do. But weeks can go by without seeing another person, and that wears on you in ways you don't expect. The nearest town's a boat ride away, and even then it's just a handful of stores and one bar where the same 5 people sit on the same 5 stools every afternoon. Sometimes I'll catch myself talking to myself just to hear a voice, or I'll leave the radio on even when I'm not really listening, just for the reassurance that other people exist somewhere beyond these trees. It was late August of 2022, and although the days were starting to shrink, it was still light out past 8 in the evening. Summer was loosening its grip, but hadn't let go yet. The air had that particular quality it gets in late summer up here. Crisp in the mornings but warming by afternoon, carrying the scent of ripe berries and the first hints of decay as plants began their slow slide toward winter. I was out on a routine survey around 12 miles north of the ranger station, deep in a section of old-growth forest that hadn't seen any logging in years, maybe decades. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light came down in scattered shafts, illuminating columns of drifting spores and insects. The terrain up there can get real tough with steep slopes that make your calves burn and your lungs work overtime. Thick underbrush grabs at your legs with every step, and streams cut through just about everywhere. Their banks slick with algae that'll dump you on your ass if you're not careful. The ground's incredibly uneven, a maze of roots and rocks hidden under moss that looks solid but sometimes isn't. I've twisted my ankle more times than I can count out here. I'd been out since dawn, leaving the cabin in that gray pre-light when everything's monochrome and silent. I spent the morning marking trees with orange paint, taking soil samples with a hand auger, recording GPS coordinates, noting signs of beetle damage or fungal infection. By early afternoon, my pack was heavy with gear, sample bags, field guides, water bottles, emergency supplies, the GPS unit, my radio which only worked in certain spots, extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency blanket, flares. You learn to carry everything you might need because there's no running to the store if you forget something. I was exhausted. My shoulders ached from the pack's weight, and my boots were caked with mud that added extra pounds with every step. The leather had darkened with moisture, and I could feel a blister forming on my right heel where the sock had bunched up despite my best efforts. So I figured I'd finish up by a little creek I knew, a spot where the water ran clear over smooth stones and you could actually see the bottom. It was one of my favorite places in this section, peaceful, with good visibility and a fallen log that made a perfect seat. I could eat my sandwich, wash off my boots in the current, maybe soak my feet for a few minutes, and then head back to the station before dark. The walk there was uneventful. I followed a game trail that paralleled a ridge, watching for fresh bear scat and listening to the ravens having some dispute in the canopy above me. Their croaking echoed through the trees, harsh and primal. A red squirrel chattered at me from a hemlock, its tail twitching with indignation at my intrusion. Everything seemed normal. I remember sitting on that fallen log by the creek, the water gurgling past my boots, unwrapping my sandwich with my head in the clouds. I was thinking about nothing important. What I'd cook for dinner, whether I should finally fix that loose board on the cabin's porch, if I'd have enough propane to last through the next cold snap. My mind was wandering, comfortable and relaxed, when a sudden sound brought me straight back down to earth with a jolt that made me fumble the sandwich. At first I thought it was a bear, and as much as they can be a threat, you get used to them out there. They're part of the landscape, as common as the trees themselves. They're mostly black bears, sometimes browns, when you get closer to the salmon streams, and they tend to move quiet and not bother anyone unless they're startled or you get between a mother and her cubs. You learn to recognize their sounds, the huff of their breath, the rustle of their movement through brush, the clack of their teeth when they're nervous. But this wasn't quiet. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like something massive pushing through the woods without any concern for stealth. Whole branches sounded like they were snapping, not just twigs or small stuff, but thick ones that should have bent or given way slowly. These broke with sharp cracks that echoed through the trees, each one distinct and violent. The sound was wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way my brain recognized before I could put it into words. I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth, cheese and turkey suddenly irrelevant. My jaw went slack and I just listened, every muscle locked in place. The noise was coming from maybe 50 yards upstream, hidden by a cluster of spruce and ferns that grew so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it clear as day, something crunching and thudding, moving slow but steady with a rhythm that reminded me of nothing I'd ever heard before. The sound had a weight to it, if that makes sense. Not just volume, but physical presence, like you could feel it in your chest with each impact. Snap, thud, methodical and relentless, getting closer with each repetition. I roughly rewrapped my sandwich with shaking hands, stuffing it into my pack without taking my eyes off the tree line upstream. I grabbed my bear spray as fast as I could, popping the safety clip and holding it out in front of me like a talisman. My thumb rested on the trigger, slick with sudden sweat despite the cool air. The canister felt too small, inadequate against whatever was making that sound. Bears usually bolt when you yell, so the first thing I did was stand up and shout, "Hey, bear, get out of here." My voice came out stronger than I felt, projecting through the trees. I waited, listening for the sound of retreat, for the crashing of something running away. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder and closer, and I very quickly realized this wasn't a bear. I've heard bears move dozens of times over the years. Their heavy rolling gait, the way they push through brush, the distinctive rhythm of 4 legs carrying bulk through the forest. This was different. It was deeper, heavier, and the rhythm was off too. It wasn't the rolling gait of a 4-legged animal. It was more like something upright, something bipedal, something that didn't care about being quiet or hiding its approach. When that thought crystallized in my mind, that I wasn't dealing with any animal I knew, I remember how my stomach dropped, how everything inside me seemed to turn to water. My hands started trembling so badly I had to grip the bear spray with both hands. I backed up a step, my boots squelching in the mud at the creek's edge, and scanned the woods with increasingly frantic movements. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. The creek gurgled behind me, oblivious and cheerful, and the ground was soft beneath my feet. But all I could focus on was that sound. Snap, thud, snap, thud. It was maybe 30 yards away now, still out of sight behind that wall of spruce and ferns. The vegetation swayed slightly with each impact, branches moving like something was pushing through them, but I couldn't make out any definite shape, just movement and shadow and that relentless approach. So I yelled again, louder this time, putting everything I had into it. "Hey, get the hell out of here! Go on!" My voice cracked on the last word, betraying my fear. The sound echoed back to me from the surrounding trees, mocking in its futility. I didn't get anything in response. No growl, no huff, no sign it had even heard me. Just that steady, unstoppable movement, like whatever it was existed in its own world where human voices meant nothing. The indifference was somehow worse than any aggressive response would have been. At least aggression you can understand, can react to. This was just nothing. like shouting at a storm or a landslide. My heart was thumping in my chest, each beat so hard it made my vision pulse. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the spray, fumbling it, catching it, gripping it harder. I've been around wild animals my whole career. Moose that stood 7 feet at the shoulder, wolves that watched from tree lines with calculating eyes, even a pissed-off mountain lion once in Minnesota that stalked me for 2 miles before finally giving up. But nothing ever felt like this. Nothing had ever filled me with this specific flavor of dread. This certainty that I was in the presence of something that existed outside the normal rules. And then the smell hit me. It rolled in on the breeze that rustled through the trees, and when it reached me I actually gagged, my throat closing, my stomach heaving. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. No bear musk with its strong but organic scent, no wet fur, not even the rot of a carcass that's been dead for days. It was sharp, almost metallic, like blood and rust mixed together. But underneath that was something else, something sour and rancid, like sweat that had gone bad, like something that hadn't bathed or cleaned itself in years. The combination was nauseating, invasive, coating the inside of my nose and the back of my throat. When it rolled over me with the breeze, thick and cloying, I gagged hard, my lunch threatening to come up. My eyes watered and I had to fight not to bend over retching, because I knew if I took my eyes off those trees for even a second, if I lost focus for even a moment, something terrible would happen. The smell was wrong on a fundamental level, triggering some deep instinctive response that screamed danger, that screamed predator, that screamed run. And that's when the panic started to really rise in my chest, flooding through my system like ice water in my veins. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. My vision seemed to narrow, focusing to a tunnel pointed at those swaying branches. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was big, too big. The way the trees moved, the way the ground seemed to vibrate with each impact, the sheer volume of those snapping branches, it all spoke of mass beyond anything that should be in these woods. A moose might snap branches. I'd seen bull moose crash through brush during the rut. Seen them demolish small trees in displays of dominance. But they're clumsy. They're loud in a different, chaotic way. All flailing legs and antlers. This sounded almost controlled. Almost purposeful. Like whatever it was knew exactly where it was going, and nothing would stop it from getting there. The sound was maybe 20 yards away now, and I could see the ferns really moving, parting around something I still couldn't make out. The top of the brush swayed and shook, and in one horrible moment I saw a branch high up, maybe 8 feet off the ground, suddenly bend and snap, falling to the forest floor with a crash. 8 feet up. 8 feet! I grabbed my pack with my free hand, the other still clutching the bear spray, and started backing down the trail, keeping my eyes on the trees upstream. My boots found the path by feel, by memory of the route I'd taken in. I didn't dare turn my back, didn't dare take my eyes off that spot where something was pushing through the vegetation with such terrible inevitability. The noise kept coming, closer now, maybe 15 yards at the most. I still couldn't see what was making it, but branches were breaking constantly now, a staccato rhythm of destruction. The ferns thrashed like something in its death throes. And still that smell, getting stronger, more oppressive, filling my nose and mouth until I thought I might vomit. I couldn't tell if it was following me or just moving parallel to my position. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. Not to sniff the air, not to investigate, not to feed or rest. Just that constant forward motion, relentless as a machine. And so I turned and ran. I'm not proud of it, but I bolted down that trail like a kid scared of the dark. Like every nightmare I'd ever had was suddenly real and breathing down my neck. My pack bounced against my back, gear clanging inside, but I didn't care. The bear spray stayed in my hand, thumb still on the trigger, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that big. I crashed through the undergrowth, following the trail by instinct more than sight. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging scratches. I jumped over roots and rocks without slowing, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs. Behind me, for just a moment, I thought I heard the sound change direction, thought I heard it pivot toward my retreat. That thought added wings to my feet. I didn't stop until I'd put a good half-mile between me and the creek, my lungs screaming for air, my legs burning with lactic acid. When I finally slowed, gasping and wheezing, bent over with my hands on my knees, the sound was gone. No snaps or thuds, just the usual hum of the forest, wind in the canopy, the distant call of a raven, my own ragged breathing. The normal sounds seemed almost offensive in their mundanity, like the forest was pretending nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, just listening and trying to make sense of everything. My heart gradually slowed from its frantic pace. My breathing evened out, but my hands kept shaking, and when I tried to take a drink from my water bottle, I spilled half of it down my shirt. What the hell was that? It wasn't a bear. I knew that with absolute certainty now. Too big and too steady, too deliberate. A person maybe, but that's impossible. Not out there, not that deep, not moving like that. I'd have seen tracks on the trail coming in, heard a voice, seen equipment, something. But there was nothing but that noise and that smell and that feeling of something massive and wrong pushing through the trees. I made it back to the station after dark, navigating the last mile by headlamp, rattled and soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. My shirt stuck to my back. My hands finally stopped shaking, but they'd been replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made each step an effort. I tried to calm myself down, told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, just stress and exhaustion playing tricks. But I could only maintain that fiction for so long before my mind started racing again, replaying every detail. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin had me sitting up and listening, reaching for the flashlight I'd put next to my bed. The wind picked up around midnight, and branches scraped against the roof like fingernails. Rain started falling around 2 in the morning. A steady drumming that should have been soothing but instead felt ominous, like it was covering the sound of something approaching. As I lay in the darkness, I kept replaying what had happened, trying to figure out what I'd heard, trying to make it fit into some rational framework. The size of it didn't add up. Bears don't move like that. Moose don't move like that. Nothing I knew moved like that. And by morning I was half convinced I'd imagined everything. Maybe I'd been out too long, gotten dehydrated despite my water bottle, and just let my mind play tricks. Maybe the sound had been trees falling naturally, avalanching down from some rot I hadn't seen. Maybe the smell had been a dead animal I'd passed without noticing, and my brain had just connected it to the sound. But I could still hear those snaps in my memory. Could still feel that faint tremor in the ground with each impact. Could still smell that awful reek. It was real. I knew it was real with the same certainty I knew my own name. A couple of days later, I told Lawrence, one of the other techs. He's been in the Tongass way longer than me, maybe 15 years. A grizzled veteran in his late 50s who's seen it all. Storms that leveled entire sections of forest, bear attacks that left hikers maimed, lost tourists who wandered off marked trails and disappeared into the green, only to be found days later hypothermic and delirious. If you name it, Lawrence has got the story and probably the scars. We were at the station splitting wood for the stove, the axe making satisfying thunks as it bit into the logs. The rhythm was meditative, and I'd been working up the courage for an hour. Finally, I just blurted it out. I heard something out there, Lawrence. Something big, bigger than it should have been. And I told him the whole story. The sound, the pattern of the snaps and thuds, the smell that made me gag. How it didn't seem to react to anything I yelled, how the branches broke 8 feet up. I told him about the size I could sense but not see, about the controlled way it moved through the forest. I even told him about the fear, which was hard to admit, the way my hands had shaken and how I'd run like my life depended on it. He listened, quiet at first, chopping away at his logs. His axe rose and fell with practiced efficiency, each swing splitting wood cleanly. When I finished, he set the axe down carefully, took off his work gloves and turned to me with a very stern look on his face. And it wasn't just disbelief or curiosity. It was something else, pity mixed with something nervous, something almost fearful, like he thought I was losing it, or like he'd heard similar stories before and knew what they meant. He asked if I was sure I wasn't hearing things. Said long days did that to a man. Said the mind could play tricks when you were alone too much. The isolation gets to everyone eventually, he said, not meeting my eyes. You start seeing things, hearing things. It's just your brain trying to create company. I said maybe, trying to laugh it off, but I could tell he didn't buy it. His face said he wanted to believe his own explanation, needed to believe it. But something in my story had rattled him. He kept glancing at me after that, quick sideways looks when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like he was waiting for me to crack or say something that would confirm his worst suspicions. The easy camaraderie we'd had before was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that made my chest tight. I forced a laugh and told him maybe I was just overtired, Maybe I'd been pushing too hard. He nodded too quickly, too eagerly, and picked up his axe again. But the look didn't go away. And that's when I decided to shut up about it. No point in making people think I'm nuts. No point in getting shipped back to Minnesota because I couldn't handle the isolation. No point in becoming that guy, the one everyone whispers about in the break room. I tried telling myself it was nothing, overwork, imagination, whatever comfortable lie would let me sleep at night. But I can't lie to myself. I just can't. The evidence of my senses was too strong, too immediate. I know what I heard. I know what I smelled. I know what I felt in my bones when that thing moved through the forest. I haven't gone anywhere near that creek since. I stick to the trails closer to the station now. The ones that see regular traffic. The ones where I can always see the ranger station's roof through the trees. It's just easier that way. I tell myself. More efficient. No point in walking 12 miles out when there's plenty of work closer in. The job's still the same. The rain, the trees, the endless quiet that presses in from all sides. But something's different now. I catch myself listening harder, waiting to hear that sound again. The forest doesn't feel quite as peaceful anymore. Every unexpected noise makes me stop and turn, heart rate spiking. Every strange smell makes me think of that awful reek. Every shadow seems to hold the potential for something massive and wrong. I haven't heard it since, and I hope to God I never do. But obviously I'll never forget it either. The memory's burned into my brain, playing on loop every time I close my eyes. Whatever it was, I think it's still out there, moving through those woods on whatever unknowable business drives it. And although I can't stop myself from thinking about it, from wondering what I encountered that day by the creek, I'm not sure I want to know what it is. Sometimes knowledge is worse than ignorance. Sometimes there are things in the world that don't fit into our neat categories. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to admit might be real. I used to think I knew these woods, thought I understood them. Now I know better. Now I know that the Tongass keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets are better left undiscovered. And yet, despite everything, I'm still here, still doing my job, still walking these trails, though never as far, never as deep, because where else would I go? This is who I am. This is what I do. And maybe in some twisted way, I need to be here, need to be close to whatever I encountered that day. The forest is still beautiful, still brutal, still home. But now I know it's also something else. Something that doesn't care about our presence, doesn't acknowledge our existence except when we stumble into its path. Something ancient and terrible and utterly indifferent to human fear. And that, somehow, is the most terrifying thing of all. I picked a quiet weekday in late October 2017 because I figured the Hall of Mosses would be slow, and I could get in and out before dinner in Forks. The weather forecast promised mid-50s and damp conditions with low cloud cover. Perfect hiking weather for someone who wanted solitude. At 32 years old, I'd spent enough time on trails to know that weekday afternoons were my sweet spot for avoiding crowds and finding the kind of peace that only comes from walking alone through ancient trees. In the visitor center, a ranger with graying temples and tired eyes answered a couple of my questions about elk migration patterns. His responses were professional and helpful, the kind of practiced information delivery you'd expect from someone who'd spent decades explaining the same ecosystem to thousands of visitors. But then, as I turned to leave, he added something that made me pause. His tone shifted slightly, became more casual, almost conspiratorial. If something copies your voice out there, don't answer it. I smiled because it sounded like park humor meant to stick in your head while you're out there. The kind of half-joke rangers tell to keep people alert without actually scaring them away. I'd only ever heard that word, skinwalker, tied to desert landscapes in the Southwest, places I don't live near and have never visited. Temperate rainforest wasn't what I pictured when I'd read about that folklore online during late-night internet rabbit holes. I wanted a short walk on a famous loop trail. That was it. Nothing ambitious, nothing challenging. Just a peaceful hour among the moss-draped trees before heading back to Seattle the next morning. The boardwalk was wet but grippy. The treated wood darkened by moisture but still providing solid traction. The trail climbs a little at first, then levels out, and gradually the sound of the Hoge River becomes more of a distant hush than the roar you hear from the parking area. You can hear steady drips coming off the moss without needing to pretend the forest is doing anything supernatural or mysterious. It's just water condensing and falling, the basic physics of a rainforest ecosystem. I let a pair of hikers pass me early on. A couple in their 50s with expensive gear and the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of hiking together. I stepped back onto the planks after they rounded a bend and kept a comfortable pace. My boots made soft thuds on the boardwalk, a rhythmic sound that helped me settle into the meditative state I'd come here for. The loop had people behind me. I could hear distant voices and occasional laughter, but I didn't see anyone ahead. It felt calm in the way a weekday afternoon often does out there, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no need to make small talk, just me and the ancient forest doing what it had done for centuries. I noticed the handprints about 10 minutes into the walk. There's a thin green film on the handrail where people don't touch as much. A layer of algae or moss that builds up in the constantly damp environment. In that film were clean ovals, places where a hand had pressed down and slid a little, wiping away the growth. 4 long finger marks, a narrow palm, then a gap of a few feet, and the same pattern repeated. The spacing was wrong. That's what caught my attention first, before I even consciously registered what I was seeing. The prints were too far apart for a normal walking pace along a handrail. Someone would have had to reach or move in an awkward shuffling gait, or I put my hand next to one for a point of reference. My palm looked blunt by comparison, my fingers shorter and thicker. Whoever made those prints had long, narrow fingers and had put their weight straight down into the rail with considerable force. The clarity of the prints suggested they were recent. The film hadn't had time to regrow. At a corner where the boardwalk turns sharply to follow the terrain, the handprints stopped. Instead, there was a faint scuff mark on the outside edge of the rail, right on top of the rounded surface, as if a foot had stepped onto it instead of around it. The mark was elongated, showing a sliding motion. I told myself someone had tried to do a stupid balance trick and bailed. It's a national park. People do dumb things for social media all the time. I'd seen plenty of evidence of that over the years. Carved initials, trash left behind, damage to fragile ecosystems from people stepping off designated paths. This was probably just another example of careless behavior. I took a few more steps forward, already starting to forget about the prints. And from up the trail, not far ahead, maybe 30 feet around the next bend, I heard my name in my brother's voice. His normal tone, the exact cadence and pitch he uses to get my attention without making a scene. There were no other words attached to it. It wasn't loud or urgent. It sounded precisely like he was standing just out of sight around that curve, waiting for me to catch up. My brother wasn't there. He lives in Colorado and had no idea I was in Washington. We hadn't spoken in 2 weeks, and our last conversation had been a brief text exchange about our mother's birthday plans. The sound made me stop moving, because there's no mistaking that tone if you've heard it 1,000 times growing up, sharing rooms, sharing space, sharing a lifetime of casual communication. I looked at the empty bend ahead, thought about the ranger's joke at the visitor center, and decided right then that I wasn't answering anything. I wasn't stepping off the boardwalk. I wasn't speeding up to investigate or chase whatever that was. My heart rate had increased noticeably, and I could feel the change in my breathing, shorter, shallower breaths that I had to consciously deepen. I took another deliberate breath, filling my lungs completely, and kept moving forward at the same steady pace. Running would be stupid. Calling out would be stupider. The big nurse log came into view after the next gentle curve. It's one of those massive fallen trees, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with younger hemlocks and small ferns growing along its entire length, feeding on the nutrients from the decomposing wood. The log is featured in half the photographs tourists take on this trail, a perfect example of forest regeneration. Perched on the moss covering the log was a shape that registered as a person for maybe half a second, and then absolutely didn't. It was too lean through the torso. The proportions all wrong in subtle ways that my brain struggled to process. The elbows were pulled back in a way I can only describe as held for control, like someone consciously maintaining an uncomfortable position. The feet were flexed at an angle I couldn't match in my head. The ankles didn't line up properly with the angle of the shins. Its chin lifted slightly as I approached, and the mouth opened farther than I expected. I didn't see teeth clearly, Just dark gums and a wet interior that seemed too wide for the face shape. The opening wasn't like someone preparing to speak or yawn. It was wider, more vertical, wrong in a way that made my stomach clench. It didn't blink. I watched for several seconds, and there was no blink reflex at all. I didn't see it breathe either. No rise and fall of the chest, no movement of the shoulders or rib cage. It watched me as if waiting for me to be the one to break, to run, to scream, to do something that would trigger whatever came next in this encounter. I didn't run. I counted in my head to 5, a focusing technique I'd learned years ago to manage stress. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It stayed perfectly still, maintaining eye contact the entire time. I shifted my weight backward carefully and slid my shoe on the board so it wouldn't squeak or make any sudden noise. When I'd put maybe 10 feet of distance between us, moving in slow backward steps while keeping my eyes on it, the figure dropped off the log in a vertical motion that didn't match the way any person would climb down from a raised surface. It simply released and descended straight down, like something with completely different joint mechanics. I didn't hear it land over the constant dripping of water from the canopy above. It wasn't trying to hide its presence. It was just there on the log, and then down on the ground, and the shape of it standing among the ferns looked tall and somehow flat, difficult to track properly in my peripheral vision. The proportions kept confusing my eyes, making it hard to maintain a clear sense of where it was in space. I adjusted my plan to something simple and actionable. Do not leave the boardwalk under any circumstances. Keep it in front of me where I could see it clearly, or off to the side within my field of vision, and back out in a straight line if necessary. No complex decisions, no weighing options, just clear rules I could follow even if panic started to set in. I started a slow retreat, walking backward while maintaining visual contact. When I sped up my steps, it sped up, moving through the undergrowth at exactly the same pace. When I slowed down to test the pattern, it slowed down to match. It never crossed onto the boardwalk or even approached the wooden structure. Instead, it moved through the understory in a line that kept it parallel to my position, with ferns and small hemlock saplings between us. When I looked to the right, making quick glances to check its position, it was already looking back at me. It didn't duck behind trees or make any attempt to hide. It didn't posture aggressively or show teeth in a threat display. It just matched my pace without making a sound I could catch over the ambient forest noise. The absence of footsteps, of breathing, of any normal sound of movement, made everything worse than if it had been crashing through the brush or making obvious threatening gestures. I forced myself to say normal things out loud, breaking the silence with my own voice. Slick board here, watch your step, moss is thick on this section. Meaningless observations, a running commentary on trail conditions, because the ranger's joke about copied voices lived in my head rent-free now, and I wanted my own voice to be the only one present, the only one I might be tempted to respond to. My throat felt tight, my voice sounded strained even to my own ears, but I kept talking. 2 hikers appeared ahead of me on the trail, a woman in a blue rain jacket, and a man with a small gray day pack. Relief flooded through me at the sight of other people, witnesses, company, safety in numbers. I didn't try to act casual because I didn't have the energy for performance. My face must have shown exactly how I felt. "Can you walk with me, please?" The words came out more urgent than I intended. They saw my expression and didn't argue or ask questions. The woman's eyes widened, and the man immediately looked around, assessing the situation. I pointed to the right, not entirely sure what they'd see through all that dense green vegetation in the low light under the thick canopy. All 3 of us watched as the figure stepped behind a wide trunk and then leaned out. Just the head and one shoulder visible. In that lean, for a split second, the profile lined up with the woman's facial features in a way that made her gasp sharply and clamp her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound. The man said, "Oh God," in a choked whisper, and that was it. No one tried to communicate with it. No one challenged it or demanded to know what it was doing. We stood there breathing hard for a long 3 seconds that felt like minutes, and then the 3 of us moved together at a steady pace toward the trailhead. We kept a formation without explicitly planning it, some instinct for group safety taking over. I took the middle position. The woman took the front because she said she wanted to know what was coming, needed to see the path ahead. The guy took the rear because he didn't want it behind him where he couldn't monitor its position. We talked on purpose about basic mundane things. where we'd parked our cars, whether the rain would start before we got back, how far it was to the parking lot. Normal conversation, ordinary words, because the familiar cadence kept us moving forward instead of freezing up or panicking. The thing never rushed us. It never fell behind or lost interest. It never tried to flank our group or cut us off. It just stayed even with us, matching our pace exactly, maintaining the same distance, stepping from one section of undergrowth to the next as we progressed along each stretch of boardwalk. Every time I let my eyes drift off the planks and into the ferns, it was already there, framed by a gap in the vegetation, shoulders angled toward us, head turned as if we were the only objects of interest in its entire world. The more I tried to study it, to understand what I was seeing, the more wrong the feet looked. The contact points with the ground didn't match the physics of weight distribution, and I hated that my brain kept trying to solve the mechanical impossibility instead of just accepting the danger and focusing on escape. We passed another stretch of handrail with green film and found a fresh line of those long handprints again, spaced out like someone had crawled or pulled themselves along while we were farther up the trail. The guy muttered that kids do weird stuff for videos these days, and I desperately wanted to believe that explanation, but the prints were too fresh and too clean and too far apart for someone fooling around and hopping on and off repeatedly. We didn't stop to examine them. We just noted their presence and kept moving, maintaining our pace and our formation. Every time I checked to the right, the shape was there. Same distance, same angle, never crossing onto the boards. The last stretch of trail opens up a little, and you can see the information kiosk through the trees. A car turned into the parking lot while we were still under the canopy, and the headlights swept across the first line of trunks beyond the road, illuminating the forest edge. In that wash of light, the figure was fully upright and visible in a way it hadn't been under the shadows. Tall, impossibly thin, arms hanging at its sides, facing us directly. It wasn't crouched or bent, or trying to use the terrain for cover. It stood there like a person stands when they've decided to be seen, to be acknowledged, to make their presence completely clear. When the headlight beam moved off and darkness returned to that section of forest, it stepped backward without turning around and was gone into the shade. Not running, not hurrying, just a smooth, controlled step back into all the visual clutter that blocks clear sight lines and makes depth perception nearly impossible in a dense rainforest. We walked straight into the visitor center. My hands were shaking slightly as I approached the desk. I didn't try to sanitize what I'd experienced or make it sound less strange. I said there was a suspicious person pacing us from off the trail, that they had matched our speed for several minutes. I said they were thin, moved silently, and seemed focused on us. I emphasized that we never left the boardwalk, never engaged, just kept moving toward safety. The couple backed me up without embellishing, describing exactly what they'd seen. The ranger on duty listened carefully, took detailed notes, wrote down the time and weather conditions, and marked the specific locations we described on a simple map of the loop trail. Another staff member grabbed a flashlight, and the two of them walked the first stretch of the trail while we stood by the kiosk trying to slow our breathing and process what had happened. When they returned about 20 minutes later, they asked for our names and phone numbers. The incident report they filed, which I later learned about when I called for a follow-up, was categorized as suspicious person, possible wildlife harassment, safety patrol requested. It felt validating to have it officially documented, not because I wanted attention or drama, but because it meant I hadn't imagined a basic sequence of events. 3 people had witnessed something, and it was now part of the park's records. I drove back toward Forks as darkness fell, realizing how quickly the forest turns completely dark under that thick canopy in late October. You don't feel the sun gradually setting. It just gets dim, then very dim, and then you're in your car with the heater running, looking at a solid wall of evergreens across the river that doesn't reveal anything past the first row of trunks. When I called the park office the next afternoon because I couldn't stop replaying the handprints and the way it had dropped off the log, the person who answered said a law enforcement ranger had walked a complete sweep of the trail before closing time. They didn't find anyone on the trail or in the immediate area, but they had observed algae smears on sections of the handrail near where I described them, and a scuff mark on the outside edge of a corner rail consistent with someone stepping onto the top surface. They added my follow-up information to the incident report and assured me they track patterns of unusual activity. I appreciated that response more than I expected to. It meant they took it seriously, that there was a system for monitoring these things. I went back to the Hall of Mosses months later, in March 2018, but only in full daylight and with company. Two friends were visiting from Portland and wanted to see the famous moss-draped trees and the impressive nurse logs. We ran the loop clockwise at noon under bright cloud cover that provided excellent visibility. It was what most people get to experience out there. Families taking photos, a couple of Roosevelt elk grazing in the river flats, children counting banana slugs on the boardwalk, exactly like the postcard version of the Pacific Northwest. I showed them the specific nurse log where I'd stopped and counted to 5 in my head. Without fog and with better light, it was just a log with small trees growing on top and a thick coating of green moss. No mystery, no anomaly, no handprints on the rails. The place looked exactly like every tourist photograph and every video clip shared online. We kept moving at a relaxed pace, took a few breaks on the wooden benches placed along the route, and finished the loop without any unusual incidents or stories to tell, except that one person in our group had a documented reason to keep his voice steady and his eyes moving. Back at the visitor center, I wrote a brief follow-up statement and asked them to attach it to my original incident number, so whoever reviews reports later has access to all the details. Which direction I was walking, what I observed, where I turned around, the timeline of events. I didn't ask for them to change how they interact with visitors or modify their standard information about trail safety. But if someone were taking bets, I'd put serious money on the fact that the joke about copied voices didn't originate from nowhere. It's a warning that sticks in your memory because it needs to, because something about this place requires that specific caution. If you go to the Hall of Mosses, remember the simplest and most important rule: stay on the boardwalk. Don't let anything coax you off the designated trail. If you hear your name in a voice that shouldn't be in that forest on a quiet weekday afternoon, keep walking. Find other people and use your own words to fill the silence. Report what you saw to the rangers and let them document it and do their jobs. I still hike in the Hohe rainforest. I go with company and during the middle of the day, and I always leave before the light starts dropping. I don't need absolute proof or scientific explanation to make that choice. I just need the memory of that feeling in my chest when the headlights swept across the trees, and that tall, thin shape stood perfectly still, and then stepped backward into the shadows, to the thing that matched my pace under the hemlocks and briefly wore a face that wasn't its own. Let's not meet again. My name is Derek Marshall. I've been a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park for over 20 years. I've seen avalanches that could swallow entire forests, bears that stood 9 feet tall when angered, and weather patterns that could kill the unprepared in minutes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what crawled out of the fog in the fall of 1994. It started innocuously enough, a weather report predicting a temperature inversion that would bring heavy fog to the northern trails. But the moment I stepped outside the ranger station that first morning, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The fog didn't behave like any natural phenomenon I'd witnessed in 2 decades on these mountains. It clung to the earth with an almost predatory patience, moving against the wind currents, defying the laws of atmospheric pressure I'd studied as a young ranger. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if microscopic fingers were wrapping around my throat with each breath. When I exhaled, my breath didn't dissipate normally. Instead, it seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding mist, pulled away from my lungs as if the fog were feeding on it. The temperature readings made no sense either. My thermometer showed 68 degrees Fahrenheit, yet frost clung to every surface, creating impossible ice crystals that formed geometric patterns too perfect to be natural. The first family went missing on a Tuesday. The car registration showed they were the Hendersons, experienced hikers from Seattle who came up to Mount Rainier every fall. Their vehicle sat in the parking lot like a tomb, windows completely opaque with frost, despite the unseasonable warmth the weather station reported. When I approached their car, my footsteps made no sound on the gravel. The fog had somehow muffled even that basic noise, creating a bubble of absolute silence around the vehicle. I led the search party myself, taking the northern trail they'd marked on their hiking permit. We called their names until our throats were raw, but the fog swallowed our voices completely. Sound didn't travel more than 10 feet before being absorbed into that unnatural mist. What we found instead of the family sent ice through my veins. Their backpacks hanging from tree branches 15 feet above the ground, shredded as if massive claws had torn through the heavy canvas like tissue paper. The tears weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns, almost like symbols carved into the fabric. Inside the destroyed packs, their supplies had been arranged in neat piles on the forest floor. Food stacked in perfect pyramids, their water bottles arranged in circles around small clearings. It was ritualistic, purposeful, as if something had been examining their belongings with terrible intelligence. But it was the silence that truly unnerved me. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. The fog pressed against my skin like cold fingers, and I swear I could feel eyes watching us from within that gray shroud. Every few minutes, shadows would shift at the edge of my vision, tall, impossibly elongated silhouettes that moved with fluid grace before vanishing when I turned my head. That night, sleep refused to come. I sat at my desk with my father's old ice axe resting against my leg, a habit I developed after losing my wife Sarah 2 years earlier in an avalanche I should have predicted. The guilt still gnawed at me, creeping into my dreams like poison. But this was different. This wasn't about my failures as a husband or a ranger. This was about something ancient and hungry that had awakened on my mountain. I flipped through my incident journal, where I documented anything unusual in the park. Over the past month, the entries had multiplied alarmingly. Elk found dead in perfect circles, their bodies unmarked but their eyes missing. Temperature drops of 40 degrees in minutes, localized to areas no larger than a softball field, and the howling sounds that started like wolves but evolved into something that resembled human speech, distorted and wrong. The next morning brought Lydia Oakes to my station. She arrived in a government vehicle, her credentials marking her as a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior. Her first words chilled me more than the unnatural frost covering my windows. "Something's driving the prey animals to mass exodus," she said, unpacking sophisticated tracking equipment. Deer, elk, even the predators themselves. They're fleeing higher elevations like their lives depend on it. She showed me thermal imaging footage from the previous week. Entire herds moving in coordinated patterns, abandoning territories they'd occupied for generations. "This isn't normal predator-prey dynamics," she explained, pointing to the screen. "This is organized terror. Something at the top of the food chain has moved in, and every other living thing knows it." Peter Holloway arrived that afternoon, fresh out of ranger training and eager to prove himself. He carried his camera everywhere, documenting everything with the enthusiasm of youth. "Maybe we'll catch Bigfoot on film," he joked, loading his pack with extra batteries and memory cards. I didn't laugh. In 20 years on these mountains, I'd learned that legends usually contained kernels of terrible truth. Dr. Martin Reynolds completed our unlikely team. The meteorologist had driven up from the University of Washington to study the fog phenomenon that was baffling weather services across the Pacific Northwest. His equipment detected organic compounds in the mist, proteins and enzymes that had no business existing in atmospheric moisture. "It's almost like the fog is alive," he murmured, staring at his readings. "The molecular structure keeps changing, adapting." The final piece of the puzzle arrived uninvited. Samuel Grycloud appeared at my station just as the sun was setting, his weathered face grave with ancient knowledge. He was an elder from the local tribal community, a man whose family had lived in the shadow of Mount Rainier for countless generations. "You need to leave," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Take your people and go. We can't just abandon missing hikers," I replied, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "They're already gone," he said. "This mountain belongs to those who walk like men when watched, but hunt like beasts when the fog comes." My grandfather's grandfather told stories of times when the mist would rise, and people would disappear, not just die, disappear, consumed. Before I could ask him to elaborate, he pointed toward the northern trails where the fog hung like a living curtain. "They sleep deep in the mountain, but the earth moves and wakes them. When they wake, they're hungry, and when they hunt, they don't leave anything behind." Samuel Grycloud left without another word, but his warning echoed in my mind as we prepared for the next day's search mission. That night, the fog grew denser, pressing against the station windows like curious hands, and somewhere in that gray shroud, I swear I heard my name being whispered in Sarah's voice. Dawn never truly came. The fog had thickened overnight into something that defied natural explanation, a gray mass so dense it seemed solid, pressing against the ranger station windows with the persistence of something alive. When I stepped outside to check our vehicles, The air felt heavy enough to swim through, and my flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet before being absorbed completely. Peter discovered the first set of tracks while setting up equipment near the parking lot. He called me over with excitement that quickly turned to confusion as we both stared at the impressions in the frost-covered ground. The prints started human, 5 clear toe marks with the distinct arch of a bare foot, but as we followed the trail, they gradually transformed. The heel elongated, the toes developed claw marks, and the gait changed from bipedal to something that moved on all fours. "What could do this?" Peter whispered, his camera clicking as he documented each print in the sequence. I had no answer. In 20 years of tracking wildlife, I'd never seen anything that could physically transform mid-stride. The prints suggested something that shifted between human and animal forms, but that was impossible, wasn't it? Lydia's wildlife cameras had captured footage that made my skin crawl. She showed us the recordings on her laptop, frame-by-frame analysis of shadows moving through the fog with impossible speed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a sequence where a tall, lanky figure seemed to glide between trees. "It covers 40 feet in less than 2 seconds, but there's no sound, no displaced air. It's like it's not quite there." The most disturbing footage showed what appeared to be a family of the creatures, if creatures they were. Moving in coordinated patterns through the forest, they communicated with subtle gestures, their elongated limbs flowing like liquid as they navigated the terrain. But it was their eyes that haunted me. Even in the grainy night vision footage, those eyes glowed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. Dr. Reynolds had spent the night analyzing fog samples, and his findings defied everything he knew about atmospheric science. "There are cellular structures in this mist," he reported, his voice shaking slightly. "Organic material that responds to stimuli. When I introduced heat to a sample, it recoiled. When I played audio recordings of human voices, it moved toward the speakers." He showed us microscopic images on his laptop, structures that looked almost like neurons, connecting and disconnecting in complex patterns. It's as if the fog itself is a neural network, a living system that can process information. But that's impossible. The radio traffic began that afternoon. We were setting up a base camp near the trail where the second family had vanished when my handheld crackled to life with sounds that made my blood freeze. At first it was just static. Then came the voices, distorted, fragmented words in broken English that seemed to emerge from the white noise itself. "Help. Come. Stay." None of us had transmitted anything. The voices continued, sometimes mimicking our own speech patterns, sometimes dissolving into inhuman growls that carried an undertone of malicious intelligence. Peter tried to record the transmissions, but every time he started his equipment, the voices would stop, as if they knew they were being monitored. "They're listening to us," Lydia whispered, her face pale. "They understand our technology." That evening, as we huddled around a small camp stove trying to heat coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I shared something I'd been reluctant to mention. I'd been researching old park records, going back decades to see if there were precedents for what we were experiencing. What I'd found in the archived files chilled me to the bone. Every 23 years, like clockwork, Mount Rainier experienced a rash of unexplained disappearances. The pattern went back over a century, always coinciding with unusual fog formations during the autumn months. The official reports blamed wildlife attacks, exposure, or simple hiking accidents. But the unofficial notes, the personal journals of rangers long dead, told a different story. "Listen to this," I said, reading from a photocopy I'd made of a 1971 incident report. Ranger Thomas Mitchell wrote, "Found the Morrison family's campsite destroyed from within, tents shredded by claws too large for any known predator. Personal effects arranged in ritual patterns. Footprints that begin human and become something else. The fog moves against the wind and whispers in voices of the dead." Mitchell had disappeared 3 days after writing that report. His body was never found. Peter's face had gone white. 23 years, he whispered. 1971 plus 23 equals 1994. The realization hit us all simultaneously. We weren't dealing with a random occurrence. This was cyclical, predictable, and we had stumbled into it at exactly the wrong time. That night, as we tried to sleep in our reinforced tent, the fog pressed against the fabric like curious hands, and we heard them for the first time, the voices calling from the mist. They knew our names, spoke in the voices of people we'd lost, whispered promises and threats in equal measure. "Derek, came Sarah's voice from somewhere in the gray shroud outside our shelter. "Derek, I'm cold. Come find me." I nearly broke then. Nearly unzipped the tent and walked into their trap. But Lydia grabbed my arm with iron strength, her eyes fierce in the flashlight's glow. "It's not her," she hissed. "Whatever's out there, it's not your wife." But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. Because Sarah's voice sounded perfect, exactly as I remembered it, down to the slight rasp she'd developed from years of mountain air. The fog knew us. It had studied us, and it was using our deepest wounds against us. The cave entrance had been exposed by a recent rock slide, as if the mountain itself had decided to reveal what it had kept hidden for generations. Ancient wooden totems surrounded the opening, weathered sentinels carved with faces that seemed to writhe in the shifting fog. The craftsmanship was unlike anything in the local tribal traditions I'd studied. These were older, more primitive, depicting creatures that stood upright like men but possessed the elongated limbs and predatory features of beasts. Dr. Reynolds took readings near the entrance, and his equipment went haywire. "Temperature drops 20 degrees within 5 feet of the opening," he reported, his breath coming in sharp puffs. "And there's air movement. Something's breathing down there, something big." The totems weren't just warnings. They were containment markers. Each one had been driven deep into the rock, their bases extending far below the surface. Whatever had carved them understood the importance of keeping something imprisoned, and the recent seismic activity had compromised their ancient seal. Peter documented everything with his camera, but the photographs came out distorted near the cave mouth. Dark shapes appeared at the edges of frames where nothing had been visible to the naked eye, and the totems' carved faces seemed to shift between shots, their expressions changing from warning to accusation. We entered the cave in single file, our flashlight beams revealing a space far larger than the narrow entrance suggested. The walls bore claw marks that scored deep gouges in solid rock marks made by something with tremendous strength and razor-sharp talons. The scratches formed patterns, almost like a written language, telling a story we couldn't read but somehow understood on a primal level. The deeper we went, the more personal items we discovered. Scattered across the cave floor were remnants of hikers from decades past, backpacks from the 1980s, camping equipment from the 1960s, even older items that looked like they belonged to pioneers from the early 1900s. Each pile of belongings was arranged with deliberate care, sorted by type and age as if cataloged by an alien intelligence. "Look at this," Lydia whispered, kneeling beside a collection of bones arranged in precise geometric patterns. They weren't just human remains. The bones had been carved with symbols, etched with the same alien script we'd seen on the cave walls. "It's not random. They're studying us, learning from us." The most horrifying discovery lay deeper in the cave system. We found what could only be described as a nursery, hollowed-out chambers lined with organic material that pulsed with its own faint luminescence. The walls were covered in a substance that felt warm to the touch, almost like living tissue, and embedded within this organic matrix were cocoons, human-shaped pods that contained shadows of movement. Dr. Reynolds took readings that made him stagger backward in revulsion. "There's brain activity," he whispered, his face pale in the flashlight glow. "Neural patterns indicating consciousness. Some of these people, they're still alive." Peter's camera captured what our eyes refused to process. Faces visible through the translucent cocoon walls. Expressions frozen in silent screams that had lasted for decades. The missing hikers hadn't been killed outright. They'd been preserved, kept alive for purposes too terrible to contemplate. That's when we heard the first howl from the depths of the cave system. It started low and mournful, like a wolf's call, but gradually transformed into something that sounded almost like speech. Other voices joined it, creating a chorus of inhuman sounds that echoed through the tunnels with haunting beauty and absolute menace. "They know we're here," Lydia said, backing toward the entrance. The howling grew closer, and with it came the sound of movement, the scrape of claws on stone, the whisper of bodies sliding through narrow passages with fluid grace. Our flashlight beams caught glimpses of them as they approached, tall figures that moved with predatory purpose, their elongated limbs allowing them to navigate the cave system with spider-like agility. The first creature we saw clearly defied every natural law I understood. It stood nearly 8 feet tall when upright, but could drop to all fours and move with the speed of a hunting cat. Its skin was pale and hairless, stretched over a skeletal frame that seemed to be able to compress and expand at will. But it was the face that paralyzed me with terror, almost human in structure, but with eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence and a jaw that could unhinge like a snake's. "Run," I whispered, but my voice carried in the cave's acoustics, and the creature's head snapped toward us with mechanical precision. More shapes emerged from the deeper tunnels, and I realized we had stumbled into their colony during what might have been a feeding ceremony. The creatures moved with coordinated purpose, cutting off our retreat routes with strategic positioning that spoke of collective intelligence. Peter tried to photograph them, but his camera's flash triggered a response that nearly cost us our lives. The creatures reacted to the bright light with inhuman shrieks that felt like ice picks driven into our skulls. They moved with explosive speed, covering impossible distances in seconds, their forms blurring between bipedal and quadrupedal motion. We ran through the cave system like mice in a maze, the creatures herding us away from the entrance and deeper into their domain. They could have caught us easily, but they were playing with us, driving us towards some predetermined destination. The howling followed us through every tunnel, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind, creating an acoustic trap that disoriented us completely. Dr. Reynolds fell behind, his equipment weighing him down as we fled through increasingly narrow passages. I heard him cry out, then silence. When I looked back, he was gone, pulled into a side tunnel by something that moved faster than my eyes could track. We eventually found ourselves in a vast chamber illuminated by the same organic phosphorescence we'd seen in the nursery. The walls were covered in the cocoons, hundreds of them arranged in neat rows like some hellish library of the living dead. Then standing among them, perfectly still, were dozens of the creatures. They weren't attacking. They were studying us with the patient curiosity of scientists examining new specimens. Their glowing eyes tracked our every movement, and I could see intelligence there. Not just animal cunning, but genuine thought processes that were analyzing, categorizing, deciding our fate. The largest of them stepped forward, its movements flowing like liquid mercury. When it spoke, the sound came not from its throat but from all around us, as if the cave itself had found a voice. "Stay," it said in perfect English, though the words seemed to be composed of multiple voices speaking in harmony. "Learn. Become." The fog we'd been breathing, the cellular structures Dr. Reynolds had detected, it was all connected. They weren't just hunting us. They were converting us, slowly altering our biology with each breath of their living mist. The missing hikers hadn't been killed. They'd been transformed, recruited into something that was neither fully human nor entirely alien. As understanding dawned, I realized why the disappearances followed 23-year cycles. That's how long the transformation process took. The cocoons weren't prisons. They were chrysalises. And somewhere in that organic matrix wrapped in pulsing tissue were people who had entered these caves decades ago and were still changing into something else. The creatures had been patient, methodical, building their numbers slowly over the centuries. But now, with modern equipment and increased park traffic, they had the opportunity to accelerate their plans. We weren't just hikers who had stumbled into their territory. We were the next phase of their evolution. Escape from the cave was only the beginning of our nightmare. The creatures didn't pursue us immediately. They didn't need to. The fog that filled our lungs with each desperate breath was already doing their work, slowly altering our body chemistry with microscopic organisms that rewrote our cellular structure. We were being changed from the inside out, transformed into something that would serve their collective needs. Peter was the first to show symptoms. His photographs from the cave had captured more than just images. The camera's digital sensors had recorded electromagnetic frequencies that human eyes couldn't perceive. When he reviewed the pictures on his camera's LCD screen, the patterns triggered something in his visual cortex. He began to see things that weren't there, or perhaps things that had always been there, but invisible to unchanged human perception. "There are so many of them," he whispered, pointing his camera at empty patches of fog. "They're everywhere, just watching us." I looked through his camera's viewfinder and felt my stomach drop. The fog was alive with movement. Dozens of tall, ethereal figures standing motionless among the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on us with patient hunger. They were invisible to normal sight, but the camera's sensors revealed their true numbers. We were surrounded by an army of creatures that existed partially outside our dimensional perception. Lydia's transformation manifested differently. Her enhanced hearing began picking up sounds in frequency ranges beyond human capability. She could hear their communications, complex ultrasonic patterns that carried meaning across vast distances. The creatures were coordinating their hunt with the efficiency of a military operation, positioning themselves throughout the mountain's trail system to cut off any possible escape route. "They're not just hunting us," she said, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. "They're hunting everyone on the mountain. Every hiker, every climber, every person who breathes their fog. This is a mass harvesting event." My own changes were more subtle, but perhaps more disturbing. I found myself understanding the patterns carved into the cave walls, comprehending the alien script as if it were a language I'd always known. The symbols told a story of patient infiltration, of a species that had learned to mimic humanity while slowly replacing it from within. They had been among us for centuries, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The fog intensified as night fell, becoming so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Our flashlights were useless. The beam would travel perhaps 2 feet before being absorbed completely. We were forced to navigate by touch and instinct, following what we hoped were familiar trails back toward the ranger station. That's when the real hunt began. The creatures moved through their element with perfect silence, stalking us through the fog like wolves tracking wounded prey. But they had evolved beyond simple predators. They were psychological hunters, using our own fears and memories against us with surgical precision. Peter heard his mother's voice calling from the mist, pleading for help in the exact tone she'd used during her final illness years earlier. The voice led him in circles, always just out of reach, until he was sobbing with exhaustion and grief. Only Lydia's enhanced hearing saved him. She could detect the ultrasonic frequencies that revealed the creature's true location, allowing us to guide him away from the trap. My own torment came in the form of Sarah's voice, speaking words she'd never had the chance to say. The creature had somehow accessed my deepest regrets, my unspoken guilt about the avalanche that had taken her life. It knew exactly which emotional wounds to probe, which memories would cause the most psychological damage. "Derek, you could have saved me," Sarah's voice whispered from the fog. "You knew the conditions were dangerous, but you let me go anyway. You wanted me to die." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, because part of me believed it was true. I had seen the weather reports, noticed the wind patterns that suggested unstable snow conditions. But Sarah had been so excited about the climbing expedition, so determined to reach the summit, that I hadn't wanted to disappoint her. Lydia grabbed my arm as I started walking toward the voice. "It's not her," she said firmly. "They're inside your head, using your memories against you. Fight it." But the psychological assault was relentless. The creatures had perfect access to our thoughts and memories through the organic compounds we'd been breathing. They knew our weaknesses, our deepest fears, our most painful losses, and they used that knowledge with the calculating precision of expert interrogators. The abandoned fire lookout tower offered temporary refuge, but even there we weren't safe. The creatures surrounded the building, their forms barely visible through the fog-covered windows. They didn't try to break in immediately. Instead, they began a campaign of psychological warfare that nearly drove us insane. They mimicked the voices of everyone we'd ever lost, every person whose death we felt responsible for. Dr. Reynolds' voice joined the chorus, begging us to save him, describing in graphic detail what was being done to him in the caves below. The sound came from everywhere at once, above us, below us, inside the walls themselves. Peter set up his camera to record the activity outside, and what he captured defied explanation. The creatures weren't just physically present. They existed across multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously. His equipment recorded them as translucent overlays, ghostly figures that occupied the same space as our reality, while extending into realms beyond human perception. "They're not entirely from our world," he whispered, reviewing the footage with shaking hands. "They're multidimensional beings, existing partially in our reality and partially in something else. That's how they can appear and disappear so quickly." The revelation explained their incredible abilities, their speed, their apparent teleportation, their resistance to physical injury. They weren't bound by the same physical laws that constrained purely three-dimensional beings. They could move through space in ways that seemed impossible because they had access to dimensions we couldn't perceive. As dawn approached, the fog began to change. Instead of thinning with the rising sun, it became more active, swirling in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. The creatures were preparing for the final phase of their hunt, gathering their forces for a coordinated assault that would leave no survivors. Through his transformed vision, Peter could see their true numbers, hundreds of creatures moving through the fog like a vast army. They had been patient, methodical, allowing us to believe we had a chance of escape while slowly tightening the noose. Now, with the dawn, they were ready to complete their harvest. "We're not getting out of this alive," I said, the weight of realization settling over me like a shroud. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm us, I noticed something in the creatures' behavior that gave me hope. They were avoiding certain areas, specific trees, particular rock formations, places where the ancient totems had been carved. The symbols we'd seen weren't just warnings. They were protective wards, markers of boundaries the creatures couldn't or wouldn't cross. If we could reach the river that cut through the valley below, if we could get beyond their territorial boundaries, we might have a chance. But first, we would have to survive their final assault, the culminating hunt that would determine whether humanity learned of their existence or became their next victims. The fog pressed against the windows like hungry hands, and somewhere in its gray depths, inhuman voices began to chant in frequencies that made our bones ache with resonance. The final hunt was about to begin. The fire lookout tower shook as something massive struck its foundation. Through the fog-shrouded windows, I could see shapes moving with predatory grace, dozens of creatures positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. They had abandoned their patient stalking in favor of overwhelming force, and the building's aged wooden structure wouldn't hold them for long. Peter's camera had become more than just documentation equipment. The electromagnetic frequencies it recorded seemed to disrupt the creatures' multidimensional abilities, forcing them to exist more solidly in our reality where they were vulnerable to physical damage. But the effect was temporary, and using the flash drained the battery quickly. "I can see their weak points," Peter whispered, reviewing his footage frame by frame. "When they're forced into our dimensional frequency, there's a spot at the base of their skull where the transformation is incomplete. That's where they're mortal." The information came at a terrible cost. Each flash of his camera brought them closer to complete dimensional collapse, but it also made them more aggressive, more desperate. They began throwing themselves against the building's walls with increasing violence, their claws leaving deep gouges in the century-old timber. Lydia's enhanced hearing picked up their communication patterns, the ultrasonic coordination that allowed them to hunt as a collective organism. They're not just individual creatures, she realized. They're nodes in a larger network, controlled by some kind of central intelligence. If we can disrupt their communication, we might be able to break their coordination. But disruption meant getting close enough to use Peter's camera effectively, and that required leaving our shelter. The creatures had demonstrated they could exist partially outside our reality, but maintaining that state required enormous energy. If we forced them to become fully physical, they would be vulnerable, but also infinitely more dangerous. The attack came at dawn, though dawn was barely distinguishable through the fog that had thickened to the consistency of gray soup. The first creature broke through the lookout's main door, its elongated form flowing like liquid mercury as it squeezed through the opening. Up close, its alien nature was even more disturbing. Skin that seemed to shift between solid matter and ethereal mist, eyes that held depths no earthly creature should possess, and a mouth that could unhinge to reveal rows of teeth designed for purposes I didn't want to contemplate. I met it with my father's ice axe, the steel blade connecting with its skull in a spray of luminescent fluid that burned my hands like acid. The creature shrieked, a sound that existed across multiple frequency ranges simultaneously, causing the building's windows to shatter and sending waves of pain through my nervous system. More of them poured through the breach, their forms adapting to the confined space with impossible flexibility. Peter's camera flashed repeatedly, each burst of light causing the creatures to solidify further, making them easier targets but also more physically dangerous. Lydia wielded a heavy flashlight like a club, its focused beam causing the creatures to recoil as if the light itself were painful. "They're photophobic in this dimension," she shouted over the chaos. "Normal light disrupts their molecular cohesion." We fought our way toward the tower's emergency exit, leaving a trail of luminescent fluid and shattered equipment in our wake. The creatures we'd injured didn't die. They began to break apart into component molecules that rejoined the fog, becoming part of the collective consciousness that surrounded us. The stairs down from the tower were treacherous in the thick mist, but the creature's fear of light gave us an advantage. Our flashlights created a small bubble of safety that allowed us to descend toward the valley floor. Behind us, the lookout tower collapsed as more creatures poured into it, their combined mass too much for the aged structure to support. Peter stumbled and fell, his camera skittering across the rocky ground. Without his equipment, we lost our ability to force the creatures into our dimensional frequency. They immediately became more ethereal, harder to target, able to strike from angles that defied three-dimensional geometry. One of them flowed around Lydia like smoke, its partially corporeal claws raking across her back before she could turn to defend herself. She cried out in pain, but the sound that emerged from her throat wasn't entirely human. It contained harmonics that matched the creature's ultrasonic communications. The transformation was accelerating. The organic compounds in the fog weren't just changing our perception. They were rewriting our DNA, incorporating alien genetic sequences that would eventually make us compatible with their collective consciousness. We were becoming them, one breath at a time. I reached the river first, plunging into the icy water that ran down from the mountain's glacial peaks. The cold was shocking, but more importantly, the running water seemed to wash away the organic particles we'd been absorbing. The creatures stopped at the water's edge, unwilling or unable to cross the flowing barrier. Peter and Lydia followed, gasping as the frigid water purged the alien compounds from their systems. On the far bank, we could breathe normally for the first time in days. The fog thinned considerably near the river, as if the flowing water disrupted whatever process maintained the creature's environmental control. But our relief was temporary. Through the clearing mist, we could see the true scope of what we faced. The creatures hadn't just been hunting us, they'd been preparing for something much larger. Across the valley, emergency vehicles were arriving at the park's main entrance, their personnel walking directly into the fog without protective equipment. "They're going after everyone," Lydia whispered. "Rangers, search teams, anyone who responds to the missing persons reports." The creatures had learned to be patient, but they were also strategic. Each new victim would become part of their collective, adding human knowledge and capabilities to their alien intelligence. They were growing stronger with each person they converted, more capable of blending into human society. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Taking my journal from its waterproof case, I tore out the pages documenting everything we'd witnessed and handed them to Lydia. "Get to the main road," I told her. "Find a way to contact the authorities, warn them what they're dealing with." "What are you doing?" she asked, though I think she already knew. "Someone has to go back," I said. "The caves, the breeding chambers, the central intelligence, it all has to be destroyed before they spread beyond this mountain." Peter grabbed my arm. "You'll never make it alone. That's suicide." He was probably right. But I'd been the ranger responsible for this mountain for 20 years. These were my trails, my responsibility, my failure. I couldn't let these things escape into the wider world because I'd been too cowardly to act. I waded back across the river, leaving Peter and Lydia on the far bank. The creatures were waiting for me, but their posture had changed. They no longer seemed to view me as prey. Instead, they watched with something that might have been respect, or perhaps anticipation. The fog embraced me like an old friend as I walked back toward the cave system. With each breath, I felt the alien compounds returning to my bloodstream, resuming their work of transformation. But now I welcomed the change. If I was going to stop them, I needed to understand them completely. By the time I reached the cave entrance, I could see them clearly without technological aid. The multi-dimensional creatures that existed between realities. The collective intelligence that had been slowly infiltrating humanity for centuries. The patient alien consciousness that viewed our species as raw material for its expansion. I could also see their weakness. The organic matrix that connected them, the living network that maintained their collective consciousness, was vulnerable to electromagnetic disruption. The cave system contained vast deposits of metallic ore that could be turned into a massive electrical conductor if subjected to the right stimulus. My father's ice axe felt different in my hands now. Not just a tool, but an extension of my will. The steel blade hummed with potential energy as I approached the cave's power source, the central nervous system of their collective consciousness. The deeper chambers revealed the true horror of their operation. The organic matrix wasn't just preserving victims, it was processing them, breaking down human consciousness and rebuilding it as part of their hive mind. Thousands of cocoons lined the walls, each one containing someone who had entered these mountains over the past century and never left. But they weren't dead. They were dreaming, their minds linked in an eternal network of shared consciousness that spanned dimensions. I could hear their voices now, whispers of hikers and climbers and rangers who had become part of something larger than individual existence. Some of them had been here so long they no longer remembered being human. The central intelligence hung from the ceiling like a massive neural web, pulsing with bioluminescent energy that coordinated every creature on the mountain. It was beautiful in its alien complexity, a living computer that processed information across multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously, and it was aware of my presence. Derek Marshall. It spoke without words, its voice resonating directly in my consciousness. 20 years you have protected this mountain. Now you understand what you have truly been guarding. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The Park Service, the official reports, the systematic cover-ups of disappearances. It hadn't been incompetence or bureaucratic blindness. Some elements within the government had known about the creatures all along, had been protecting them, feeding them, using their abilities for purposes I could barely comprehend. We are not invaders, the intelligence continued. We are evolution. Humanity has reached its limit as a species. We offer transcendence, unity, purpose beyond individual mortality. I could feel the truth in its words, the seductive logic of collective consciousness. No more loneliness, no more grief, no more fear of death. Just eternal connection to something vast and purposeful. The transformed part of my mind found the offer compelling. But the part that was still human, still Derek Marshall, still remembered Sarah's laugh, and the weight of individual responsibility. I raised the ice axe toward the central intelligence, and the entire cave system shuddered as if the mountain itself were in pain. No, I said simply. The creatures rushed me from every direction, their forms shifting between dimensions as they attempted to stop what they recognized as an existential threat. But I was no longer entirely human myself. The transformation had given me access to their abilities, their multidimensional perception, their resistance to normal physical laws. I struck the central intelligence with everything I had. Not just physical force, but the accumulated anger and grief and determination of 20 years protecting these mountains. The ice axe's steel blade conducted electrical energy from the metallic ore deposits, sending cascading feedback through their neural network. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The organic matrix began to convulse, electrical fires racing along its neural pathways as the creature's collective consciousness tore itself apart. The cocoons lining the walls split open, releasing their occupants in various stages of transformation. Some of them had been changed too completely to return to human form. They dissolved into component molecules, their individual consciousness already absorbed beyond recovery. But others, the more recent victims, gasped back to awareness as the network that had held them captive collapsed. The cave system began to collapse as well, centuries of alien architecture failing without the intelligence that had maintained it. I helped the survivors I could reach, guiding them toward the surface as rocks fell around us and the mountain itself groaned in protest. The fog began to dissipate as we emerged, the countless creatures that had maintained it losing coherence as their central nervous system died. For the first time in weeks, natural sunlight penetrated the forest canopy, revealing the true scope of the destruction. Bodies lay scattered throughout the woods, not the missing hikers but the creatures themselves. Their multidimensional forms, unable to maintain cohesion without their collective consciousness. They looked smaller in death, almost pitiful, their alien features softened by the morning light. I made it as far as the river before the transformation caught up with me. The alien compounds in my bloodstream had been too deeply integrated to be completely purged. I was changing, becoming something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. Peter and Lydia found me there, sitting by the water's edge with my journal in my hands. I had just enough time to tell them everything: the government conspiracy, the cyclical nature of the creature's breeding cycle, the locations of other sites around the world where similar intelligences might be dormant. Every 23 years, I whispered as my vision began to shift into frequencies beyond human perception. They'll try again, somewhere else. You have to be ready. The transformation completed itself as the sun reached its zenith. I felt my individual consciousness expand, touching the edges of something vast and alien, but also fundamentally changed by its contact with humanity. The creature's collective intelligence hadn't been entirely destroyed. It had been transformed, infected with human individuality and emotion. I became something new, a bridge between species, a guardian that could perceive both human and alien perspectives. The missing hikers who had been too changed to return to normal life joined me, forming a new kind of collective that valued individual consciousness while sharing collective knowledge. We made ourselves invisible to normal human perception, watching over the mountain as its original protectors had done, but with a different purpose. Where the alien intelligence had sought to consume humanity, we sought to protect it from threats beyond normal understanding. Years later, when Peter returned as a senior ranger, he would sometimes catch glimpses of us moving through the forest. He established new protocols based on the information in my journal, warning systems that could detect the electromagnetic signatures that preceded similar manifestations. The official reports blamed the disappearances on a series of cave-ins caused by seismic activity. The survivors who had been rescued from the collapsing cave system were debriefed by government agents and sworn to secrecy. Most of them tried to forget what they had experienced, but a few joined Peter and Lydia in maintaining vigilance against future incursions. The fog still comes to Mount Rainier during certain autumn months, but now it behaves according to natural atmospheric laws. The ancient totems remain in place, their warnings still valid, their protection still necessary, and somewhere in the deep forests, those of us who were changed continue our watch. We are no longer fully human, but we remember being human. We guard against the day when other alien intelligences might attempt what our predecessors failed to achieve, and we wait, patient as the mountains themselves, for the next cycle to begin. Because they will return. Perhaps not in 23 years, perhaps not to Mount Rainier, but somewhere, somewhen, humanity will face similar choices between individual consciousness and collective transcendence. When that time comes, we will be ready. The Fog Walkers have become something new. Guardians born from the collision of two incompatible forms of existence. Protectors who understand both the allure and the danger of losing oneself in something larger. The mountain keeps its secrets, as mountains always have. But now those secrets include guardians, who were once human. Watchers who remember what it means to be individual consciousness facing the infinite. We are the price of victory, the cost of protection, the living reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed. And in the fog that rises naturally from the valleys, in the mist that clings to morning forests, we continue our vigil. No longer human, not quite alien, but something that bridges the gap between worlds and stands guard against the darkness that waits beyond the edges of reality. The story ends, but the watch continues. In the space between dimensions, in the moments between heartbeats, we remain. The Fog Walkers of Mount Rainier, eternal sentinels born from humanity's refusal to surrender its individual soul to collective oblivion. The old pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Brett Radford gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he navigated the familiar twists and turns leading to the Deep Creek wilderness. The cab smelled of gun oil and coffee, a scent that usually brought comfort but now did little to calm his nerves. Brett glanced at his passenger, Sam Kearns, who was slumped against the window, snoring softly. Friends since high school, they'd been on countless hunting trips together, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in Brett's chest that he couldn't shake, a feeling that had taken root months ago when his mother passed and hadn't let up since. As the first hints of dawn began to color the sky, Brett's mind wandered to the farmhouse he'd left behind, the creaky porch swing where his mom used to sit, the fields that needed tending, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. It all weighed on him, threatening to crush him under their collective mass. "This trip will help," he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow in the quiet cab. "Just need to clear my head." The truck hit a particularly deep pothole, jolting Sam awake. He blinked blearily, rubbing his eyes. "We there yet?" Brett shook his head. "Another mile or so." "How'd you sleep?" Sam yawned, stretching as much as the cramped cab would allow.
"Like a baby. You look like hell, though. Did you get any rest?"
Brett's lips tightened into a thin line. He hadn't, in fact, slept more than a couple of hours. The nightmares had come again, Visions of his mother's pale face in the hospital bed, of the farm withering away, of himself drowning in a sea of golden wheat, but he wasn't about to burden Sam with all that. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just eager to get out there." Sam nodded, but Brett could feel his friend's worried gaze. They'd known each other too long for Sam not to see through the facade, but he mercifully chose not to press the issue. The truck rounded a final bend, and the entrance to the Deep Creek wilderness came into view. A weathered wooden sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes, marked the spot where they'd leave civilization behind. Brett felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he pulled off to the side of the road and cut the engine. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the chorus of early morning birds. The forest loomed before them, a wall of green that seemed to swallow all sound and light. Brett had always loved these woods, but today they felt different, oppressive, almost. "You sure about this place?" Sam asked, his voice unusually hesitant. "We haven't been here in years. Might be better to stick to our usual spot." Brett shook his head, already reaching for the door handle. "Nah, we need something different. Besides, game's been scarce lately. This far out, we're bound to find something." They climbed out of the truck, the cool morning air nipping at their skin. Brett took a deep breath, trying to let the earthy scent of the forest calm his nerves. He busied himself with unloading their gear, rifles, backpacks, a small cooler of provisions. The familiar routine helped ground him, pushing back the nagging doubts and worries that had plagued him for months. As they shouldered their packs and checked their weapons, Brett caught Sam giving him another concerned look. "What?" he asked, more sharply than he'd intended. Sam hesitated, then seemed to make up his mind. "Look, Brett, I know things have been tough since your mom, well, since everything happened. If you need to talk—" "I don't," Brett cut him off, immediately regretting his tone. He softened his voice. "I appreciate it, Sam. Really. But I'm okay. This trip is exactly what I need." Sam didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right, just here if you change your mind." Brett managed a genuine smile this time, grateful for his friend's unwavering support. "Thanks. Now, let's go bag us some dinner, huh?" With a final check of their gear, they set off down the overgrown trail that led into the heart of the Deep Creek wilderness. The dense canopy overhead quickly blotted out what little morning light had begun to filter through, plunging them into a world of green shadows and muted sounds. As they walked, Brett felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift, if only slightly. The rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant call of a woodpecker, it all combined into a soothing symphony that allowed his mind to quiet, if only for a moment. But as the trail wound deeper into the forest, that initial sense of peace began to give way to something else. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The bird calls grew fewer and far between, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of Brett's neck stand up. He glanced at Sam, wondering if his friend felt it too. Sam's eyes were darting from side to side, his grip on his rifle just a little too tight, so it wasn't just in Brett's head. "Awful quiet," Sam murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Brett nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, maybe we should—" A sudden crash in the underbrush to their left cut him off. Both men whirled, rifles at the ready, hearts pounding. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, a shape emerged from the shadows, a young deer, its eyes wide with fear. The tension broke, and both men let out nervous laughs. "Jumpy as a pair of greenhorns," Sam chuckled, lowering his weapon. Brett forced a smile, but the unease lingered. As the deer bounded away, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the dense foliage around them, half expecting to see eyes gleaming in the shadows. There was nothing there, of course, just trees and leaves, and the occasional shaft of sunlight breaking through the canopy. And yet, "Let's keep moving," Brett said, his voice tight. "Still got a ways to go before we reach the good hunting grounds." As they resumed their hike, the silence of the forest seemed to close in around them. Brett tried to focus on the path ahead, on the promise of a successful hunt, on anything but the growing sense of wrongness that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He'd come to these woods seeking peace, a respite from the burdens of his life. Instead, With every step deeper into the Deep Creek wilderness, he felt those burdens growing heavier, as if the very air was thick with unspoken dread. Little did Brett know, as he and Sam pressed on into the heart of the forest, that their real ordeal was only just beginning. The horrors that awaited them in the depths of Deep Creek would make the struggles of the past few months pale in comparison. The hunt had begun, but they were no longer the predators. As the day wore on, Brett and Sam pushed deeper into the wilderness. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by their labored breathing, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The dense canopy overhead filtered the sunlight, casting everything in a sickly green hue. "We should have seen some game by now," Sam muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Place feels wrong." Brett nodded, unable to shake the growing sense of unease that had settled in his gut. "Maybe we should turn back, try our luck elsewhere." Before Sam could respond, the trees suddenly opened up into a small clearing. At its center, a creek gurgled softly, its waters glinting in the filtered sunlight. Both men breathed a sigh of relief at the open space. "Good a place as any to take a break," Brett said, shrugging off his pack. Sam nodded in agreement, and they settled down by the water's edge. As they ate a quick lunch of jerky and trail mix, Brett found his eyes drawn to the far side of the clearing. Something about the way the underbrush was disturbed nagged at him. It looked as if something large had pushed through recently. "Sam," he said quietly, nodding towards the disturbance. "You see that?" Sam squinted, then nodded slowly. "Yeah. Weird. Too big for a deer." Brett stood, drawn by curiosity and a growing sense of dread. He crossed the shallow creek, the cold water seeping into his boots. As he approached the disturbed area, his breath caught in his throat. There, pressed into the soft mud, was a set of tracks unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were massive, easily twice the size of his hand, with long curved claw marks at the end of each toe. "What the hell?" Sam whispered, having followed Brett across the creek. Brett shook his head, a chill running down his spine despite the warmth of the day.
"I don't know. Never seen anything like it."
They stared at the tracks in silence for a long moment, the cheerful babbling of the creek now seeming out of place in the oppressive atmosphere of the clearing. "We should go," Sam said finally, his voice tight with barely contained fear. "Whatever made those, I don't want to meet it." But even as he spoke, Brett found himself drawn to the tracks, a morbid curiosity overriding his instinct for self-preservation. "We should follow them," he heard himself say, just to see where they go." Sam looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Are you crazy? We need to get out of here." But Brett was already moving, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. After a moment's hesitation, Sam cursed under his breath and followed. As they pushed deeper into the unknown, the forest seemed to close in around them. The bird calls that had been sparse before now ceased entirely. Even the insects fell silent, as if the entire wood was holding its breath. They had been following the trail for nearly an hour when they came upon the ravine. It was deep and narrow, its walls steep and treacherous. The tracks led right to the edge and then disappeared. Cautiously, Brett approached the rim, peering down into the shadows below. What he saw made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the ravine lay a gruesome sight. Bones, some still with scraps of flesh clinging to them, were scattered about. Torn pieces of clothing fluttered in the faint breeze, and in the center of it all, a crumpled backpack, its bright blue fabric a stark contrast to the grisly scene. "Jesus Christ," Sam breathed, his face pale. "Those are—" Brett nodded, unable to form words. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. What kind of animal could do this? And why hadn't they heard about missing hikers or campers? Before he could voice any of these questions, a sound broke the silence. It was low and guttural, a noise that seemed to vibrate in Brett's very bones. Slowly dreading what he might see, he turned. There at the edge of the clearing stood a creature out of nightmares. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted dark fur. Its limbs were unnaturally long and thin, ending in hands tipped with wicked claws. But it was the face that would haunt Brett's dreams for years to come. It was a twisted parody of something almost human, with a mouth full of jagged teeth that seemed to split its head in two. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other, man and monster. Then, with a roar that shook the trees, the creature charged. "Run!" Brett screamed, grabbing Sam's arm and yanking him away from the ravine's edge. They crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping their faces as they fled in blind terror. Behind them, they could hear the creature giving chase, its howls echoing through the forest. Brett's lungs burned as he ran faster than he ever had in his life, the sound of his pounding heart nearly drowning out the monster's pursuit. They burst into another clearing, and Brett's eyes locked onto a dilapidated structure ahead, an old hunting cabin. "There," he gasped, pointing. They sprinted for the cabin, throwing themselves through the door and slamming it shut behind them. In the dim interior, they scrambled to barricade the entrance, pushing old furniture and anything else they could find against it. Outside, they could hear the creature circling, its claws scraping against the wooden walls. The whole cabin shook with each impact, dust and debris raining down from the sagging roof. "What the fuck is that thing?" Sam gasped, his back pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. Brett shook his head, struggling to catch his breath. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. It'll get in eventually." They searched the cabin desperately for anything they could use as a weapon. All they found were some rusted tools and an ancient shotgun with no ammunition. As the creature continued its assault on their refuge, Brett's mind raced. The truck was their only hope, but it was a good mile away through dense forest. With that thing out there, their chances were slim. But they had no choice. It was either make a run for it or wait to be torn apart in this crumbling cabin. "We need to make a break for it," Brett said, gripping a rusted axe he'd found. "Head for the truck. It's our only shot." Sam nodded, his face pale but determined. "Okay, on 3? Brett took a deep breath, steeling himself. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They burst out of the back window, glass shattering around them as they hit the ground running. Immediately they heard the creature's roar of rage as it realized its prey was escaping. They ran through the forest, branches and thorns tearing at their clothes and skin. Brett could hear the monster crashing through the underbrush behind them, gaining ground with every passing second. The truck came into view just as Brett felt the creature's hot breath on the back of his neck. With a final burst of speed, they reached the vehicle. Brett fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, mercifully, the door unlocked. They dove inside just as the creature slammed into the side of the truck, the metal groaning under the impact. Brett jammed the key into the ignition and cranked it. For a heart-stopping moment, the engine sputtered. Then, with a roar that rivaled the creature's, it came to life. He threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. Tires spun in the dirt before finding purchase, and they shot forward. The creature gave chase for a few hundred yards before falling behind, its howls of frustration fading into the distance. They didn't stop until they hit the main road, the safety of civilization finally in sight. Only then did Brett ease off the gas, his hands shaking as the adrenaline began to wear off. What the hell was that thing?" Sam whispered, his voice hoarse. Brett shook his head, unable to form words. His mind was still reeling, trying to process what they'd seen, what they'd experienced. As they drove in silence, the horrors of the day replaying in their minds, Brett couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't over. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, lurking in the depths of the Deep Creek wilderness. And somehow, he knew, their paths would cross again. The days following their terrifying encounter in Deep Creek wilderness passed in a haze for Brett. He and Sam had reported what they'd seen to the local authorities, but their story was met with skepticism and thinly veiled disbelief. "Probably just a bear," the sheriff had said, his tone dismissive. "You boys were out there alone, got spooked. Minds can play tricks on you in the woods." But when a search party went to investigate the ravine Brett and Sam had described, they found nothing. No bones, no torn clothing, no sign of the creature. It was as if the entire incident had been a shared hallucination. Brett sat on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The farm stretched out before him, the fields he'd neglected now overgrown and wild. He should care, he knew. This was his legacy, his responsibility. But after what he'd seen in those woods, the struggles of everyday life seemed trivial. His nights were plagued by nightmares. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's roar echoing in his ears. Its twisted face burned into his retinas. During the day, he jumped at every shadow, every unexpected sound. The world that had once seemed so familiar now felt alien and threatening. Sam wasn't faring much better. They'd spoken a few times since that day, but the conversations were stilted, neither of them willing to delve too deeply into what they'd experienced. It was easier to pretend it had never happened, to try and go back to their normal lives. But Brett knew, deep in his bones, that normal was a luxury he'd never have again. A knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. He tensed, his heart racing, before forcing himself to calm down. "It's just a visitor," he told himself. "Not every sound is a threat." He opened the door to find Linda Summers, his nearest neighbor, standing on the porch with a covered dish in her hands. "Thought you could use some home cooking," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been holed up here for days." Brett managed a weak smile in return. "Thanks, Linda. Come on in." As they sat at his kitchen table, Linda's eyes roamed over the stack of unopened mail, the unwashed dishes in the sink, her brow furrowed with concern. "Brett, honey, are you okay? People in town are worried about you. There are rumors." He stiffened. "What kind of rumors?" Linda hesitated. "Well, you know how people talk. They're saying you and Sam saw something out in Deep Creek. Something not natural." Brett's hands clenched involuntarily, his knuckles white. For a moment he considered telling her everything. The creature, the bones in the ravine, the terror that still gripped him. But the words died in his throat. "It was nothing," he said finally. "Just got a bit turned around out there, that's all." Linda didn't look convinced, but she nodded, patting his hand gently. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. And Brett, maybe think about getting out of the house a bit. Fresh air might do you good." After she left, Brett stood at the window, staring out at the tree line that marked the edge of his property. The forest that had once been a source of comfort now loomed ominously, hiding untold horrors in its depths. He knew he should take Linda's advice, should try to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But every time he thought about stepping outside, about venturing anywhere near those woods, panic clawed at his throat. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, Brett knew the truth. What he and Sam had seen that day in Deep Creek wasn't the end of something. It was only the beginning. Weeks passed, and life in the small town near Deep Creek Wilderness began to return to normal. For everyone except Brett. He'd become a virtual recluse, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. The farm, once his pride and joy, fell further into disrepair. It was on a particularly sleepless night that Brett found himself sitting in his darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the window at the moonlit fields beyond. The alcohol did little to quiet the thoughts racing through his mind, or ease the constant state of hypervigilance he'd been living in since that fateful hunting trip. A sudden movement at the edge of the woods caught his eye. Brett froze, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he thought he saw a tall, misshapen figure standing just beyond the tree line, but when he blinked, it was gone. "You're losing it, Radford," he muttered to himself, running a shaky hand through his unkempt hair. But even as he tried to rationalize what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, a part of him knew better. The creature was out there, watching, waiting. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the silence, making Brett jump. He hesitated, staring at the receiver as if it might bite him. Finally, on the fifth ring, he answered. "Hello?" His voice was rough from disuse. "Brett, it's Sam. We need to talk." Brett's grip tightened on the phone. He hadn't spoken to Sam in weeks, both of them seemingly content to pretend their shared ordeal had never happened. "What's wrong?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sam spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I've been hearing things, Brett. Seeing things. I think it followed us out of the woods." A chill ran down Brett's spine. "What do you mean?" "Footprints in my backyard. Scratches on my door. And last night I swear I saw it standing outside my window. We can't ignore this anymore, man. We need to do something." Brett closed his eyes, a wave of dread washing over him. He'd hoped desperately that if he just stayed away from the woods, if he pretended hard enough, the nightmare would end. But Sam's words confirmed his deepest fears. There was no escaping what they'd unleashed. "What can we do?" Brett asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing some research," Sam replied. There are stories, legends about creatures like what we saw. I think I might know what it is, but we need to meet. This isn't something we can talk about over the phone. Brett glanced out the window again, half expecting to see the creature's twisted face pressed against the glass. Okay, he said finally. Tomorrow. The diner in town. Noon. After hanging up, Brett sat in the darkness, his mind reeling. Part of him wanted to pack a bag and run, to put as much distance between himself and Deep Creek as possible. But he knew, deep down, that running wasn't an option. Whatever this thing was, wherever it had come from, it was tied to them now. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Brett made a decision. He couldn't hide anymore. It was time to face the terror head on, to find answers, and to put an end to the nightmare that had consumed his life. Little did he know, the true horrors were only just beginning. The diner was nearly empty when Brett arrived, the lunch rush not yet in full swing. He spotted Sam in a corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, looking as haggard as Brett felt. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame, as if he'd lost a significant amount of weight in a short time. "You look like hell," Brett said by way of greeting, sliding into the booth across from his friend. Sam managed a weak smile. "Look who's talking." He pushed a manila folder across the table. "I found some things. You're not gonna like it." Brett opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were printouts of old newspaper articles, grainy photographs and handwritten accounts. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "These go back decades," he murmured. "Disappearances, sightings of a forest demon, all centered around Deep Creek." Sam nodded grimly. "It's been happening for generations. Every few years people go missing. Hunters, hikers, sometimes whole families. The authorities always chalk it up to animal attacks or people getting lost in the woods. But we know better." Brett's mind raced as he absorbed the information. "But what is it? Where did it come from?" Sam leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's an old Native American legend about a creature called the Wendigo. It's said to be a malevolent spirit that possesses humans, turning them into monstrous. Match what we saw, Brett. I think that's what we're dealing with." Brett shook his head, struggling to process this information. "But that's just a legend, right? It can't be real." Sam's eyes were haunted as he replied, "After what we saw in those woods, can you really say anything is impossible?" Before Brett could respond, the diner's door chimed. Both men tensed, turning to see who had entered. It was Linda Summers, Brett's neighbor. She spotted them and made her way over, her face etched with concern. "Brett, Sam, I'm glad I found you," she said, sliding into the booth next to Brett. "There's something you need to know. My grandson, Toby, he's missing. Went camping up near Deep Creek 3 days ago and never came back." Brett and Sam exchanged a look of horror. "Have you contacted the authorities?" Brett asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Linda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "They've organized a search party, but I remembered the stories you two came back with. I thought maybe you could help." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Brett's shoulders. He knew they couldn't tell Linda the truth. She'd never believe them, but they couldn't sit by and do nothing either. "We'll help with the search," Brett said, his decision made. "When do they head out?" "First light tomorrow," Linda replied, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you, both of you." After Linda left, Sam turned to Brett, his expression grim. "You know we're not just going to be searching for her grandson, right? We're going after that thing." Brett nodded, a mix of fear and determination coursing through him. "I know, but we can't let it take anyone else. We have to end this." As they left the diner, neither man noticed the tall, shadowy figure watching them from the edge of the nearby woods, its eyes gleaming with inhuman hunger. The search party gathered at the entrance to Deep Creek Wilderness, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. There were about 20 people in total, local law enforcement, experienced trackers, and volunteers from the town. Brett and Sam stood slightly apart from the group, checking their gear one last time. Sheriff Holbrook, a grizzled man in his late 50s, addressed the crowd. "All right, folks, we're looking for Toby Summers, 17 years old. Last seen entering the park 3 days ago. We'll split into teams of 4. Stay in radio contact at all times. If you find anything at all, you call it in. Don't try to be a hero. Questions? As the sheriff divided the group into teams, Brett and Sam exchanged a knowing look. They had their own agenda, their own quarry to hunt. The teams spread out, disappearing into the dense forest. Brett and Sam's group, which included 2 local deputies, headed northeast, following the trail Toby was believed to have taken. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, Brett felt the familiar sense of unease creeping over him. The forest seemed to press in around them, the trees blocking out more and more sunlight until they were walking in a perpetual twilight. Hours passed with no sign of Toby or anything out of the ordinary. The deputies began to tire, their initial enthusiasm waning. But Brett and Sam remained alert, their senses heightened by the memory of their last encounter in these woods. It was late afternoon when they heard it, a low guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The deputies froze, hands moving to their holstered weapons. "What was that?" one of them whispered, eyes darting nervously. Before anyone could respond, the sound came again, closer this time. Brett's blood ran cold as he recognized it. The same haunting call they'd heard before encountering the creature. "Run," Brett said, his voice tight with fear. Back to the entrance. Now. The deputies hesitated for a moment, but another roar, even closer, spurred them into action. They took off running, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Brett and Sam stood their ground, weapons at the ready. They'd come prepared this time. Shotguns loaded with special rounds Sam had procured, supposedly blessed by a local shaman. The creature burst into view, its massive form somehow even more terrifying in the fading daylight. Its eyes locked onto Brett and Sam, a terrible intelligence burning in their depths. For a moment everything was still. Then, with a roar that shook the very trees, the Wendigo attacked. Brett fired, the shotgun's report deafening in the enclosed space. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Sam's shot followed, and this time the monster howled in pain, black ichor oozing from its wounds. But it wasn't enough. The Wendigo lunged forward, its claws raking across Brett's chest. He cried out in pain, stumbling backward. Sam fired again, drawing the creature's attention. "Brett, run," Sam shouted, already backing away. "I'll draw it off." Despite the pain, Brett hesitated. He couldn't leave his friend, but Sam was already disappearing into the woods, the Wendigo in hot pursuit. Clutching his bleeding chest, Brett staggered after them. The forest blurred around him, branches whipping his face as he ran. He could hear the sounds of the chase ahead. Sam's labored breathing, the creature's inhuman shrieks. Suddenly, the noises stopped. Brett burst into a small clearing, his heart pounding. There, in the center, stood the Wendigo. At its feet lay Sam, motionless. "No," Brett screamed, raising his shotgun. But before he could fire, something hard struck the back of his head. The world spun, then faded to black. Brett awoke to pain and darkness. He was lying on a cold, damp surface. Stone, he realized. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something else. Something alien and horrifying. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he made out rough stone walls. A cave, he realized. But where? And where was Sam? Memory flooded back. The chase through the woods. Sam's still form. The blow to his head. Brett tried to sit up, but found his wrists and ankles bound with what felt like roots or vines. A shuffling sound nearby made him freeze. Slowly, painfully, he turned his head. There in the shadows stood the Wendigo. But it was different now. Smaller, almost human-sized. And its face. Brett's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the twisted features. "Sam?" he whispered. Horror and disbelief warring in his mind. The thing that had been Sam smiled, its mouth full of jagged teeth. When it spoke, its voice was a rasping parody of his friend's. "Not quite," it said. "Sam's still in here somewhere, screaming. But I'm in control now." Brett's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. "Why?" he managed to croak out. The Wendigo Sam crouched beside him, its breath hot and fetid. "Why? Because I was hungry. Because I've been hungry for centuries. And because you humans, with your curiosity and your arrogance, keep coming into my woods." It reached out a clawed hand, tracing a line down Brett's cheek. "I could have taken you that day by the ravine. But where's the fun in that? The fear makes the meat so much sweeter." Brett struggled against his bonds, panic giving him strength. But it was useless. The roots held firm, digging painfully into his flesh. The Wendigo Sam stood, moving to the cave's entrance. Rest now. You'll need your strength. When the moon is full, we feast. And then, Brett, you'll join us. A new body for an old hunger. As the creature disappeared into the darkness, Brett lay there, his mind racing. He had to escape, had to warn the others. But more than that, he had to find a way to save Sam, if there was anything left of his friend to save. The weight of hopelessness pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. But as he lay there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, a small spark of determination flickered to life. He wasn't dead yet, and as long as he was alive, he would fight. For himself, for Sam, and for every person who might fall victim to this ancient evil. With renewed purpose, Brett began to work at his bonds, ignoring the pain as the roots bit into his skin. He had no idea how much time he had before the Wendigo returned, but he was determined to make every second count. As he struggled, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a battle for his very soul. Time lost all meaning in the darkness of the cave. Brett drifted in and out of consciousness, his efforts to free himself leaving him exhausted and bloody. But slowly, agonizingly, he felt the roots begin to loosen. Just as he managed to work one hand free, a sound from the cave entrance made him freeze. The Wendigo Sam was returning, and it wasn't alone. "I brought you a friend," the creature said, its voice a mockery of Sam's familiar tones. It dragged a limp form into the cave and tossed it carelessly to the ground. Brett's heart sank as he recognized Toby Summers, Linda's missing grandson. The boy was alive but barely conscious, his clothes torn and bloody. The Wendigo Sam crouched between them, its twisted face split in a terrible grin. "The moon will be full soon, and then we'll all be family." As the creature turned its attention to Toby, Brett saw his chance. With a surge of desperate strength, he tore free from the remaining roots and lunged for the shotgun that lay forgotten in the corner of the cave. The Wendigo Sam whirled, its inhuman speed nearly allowing it to intercept Brett. But he managed to grab the weapon and bring it to bear, his finger finding the trigger. The blast in the confined space was deafening. The creature staggered back, black ichor spurting from its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar of rage and pain that shook dust from the cave walls. Brett pumped the shotgun and fired again, and again. Each shot drove the Wendigo Sam back. But still, it kept coming. In its eyes, Brett saw a hunger that centuries had not diminished, a darkness that threatened to swallow everything. As he fired the last shell, Brett silently apologized to his friend. If there was anything left of Sam in there, he hoped this would release him. The Wendigo Sam collapsed to its knees, its body riddled with wounds that would have killed any mortal creature. But still, it lived. Still, it reached for Brett with clawed hands. "You can't kill me," it rasped. "I am eternal. I am hunger itself." Brett stood over the fallen creature, his shotgun empty but still clutched in his hands. "Maybe," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I can stop you. Here, now." With all his remaining strength, Brett brought the shotgun down on the Wendigo Sam's head. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th blow, something seemed to break. Not just in the creature's skull, but in the very air around them. A howl rose up, not from the Wendigo Sam's ruined mouth, but from everywhere. It was a sound of ancient rage, of thwarted hunger. The cave trembled, rocks falling from the ceiling. Brett staggered back, grabbing the still dazed Toby. "We have to get out of here," he shouted over the unearthly wail. They stumbled out of the cave just as it began to collapse, the entrance disappearing in a cloud of dust and falling rocks. The forest around them seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself was rebelling against what had just occurred. Brett half-carried, half-dragged Toby through the woods, guided by some instinct he couldn't name. Behind them, the sounds of destruction continued, a cascade of breaking trees and shifting earth. As they broke through the tree line, Brett was momentarily blinded by sunlight. They had emerged near the park entrance, where a crowd of searchers had gathered. "Help!" Brett croaked, his strength finally giving out. He collapsed to the ground, Toby falling beside him. The last thing Brett saw before consciousness fled was Linda Summers rushing towards them, tears streaming down her face. Then, mercifully, darkness took him. Brett stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the distant line of trees that marked the border of Deep Creek Wilderness. 6 months had passed since that day in the cave, but the memories remained as sharp as ever. The official story was that he and Toby had gotten lost in the woods, that their injuries were the result of a fall. The cave-in was attributed to unstable geology, and Sam was still listed as missing, presumed dead. Brett knew the truth, of course. He saw it in his nightmares, felt it in the scars that crisscrossed his body, but he kept silent. Who would believe him? The farm was running again, the fields green and vibrant. Brett had thrown himself into the work, finding solace in the mindless labor, but always his eyes were drawn to the forest. He didn't know if the Wendigo was truly gone. Part of him feared that such an ancient evil could never be fully destroyed, but he had made a vow, standing over the broken body of the thing that had once been his friend. Never again would he turn a blind eye to the darkness in the woods. Never again would he allow fear to paralyze him. If the hunger returned, if the ancient evil crawled out of whatever hell it had been banished to, Brett would be ready. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the land, Brett turned back toward his house. There was work to be done, preparations to be made. The battle might be over, but the war, he suspected, had only just begun.